Although porting video games to different platforms seems like easy money on a theoretical level, the practical side of actually pulling it off can be a hell of a lot harder. If a weaker system isn't tailored for a specific title, it's likely that the graphics and the performance will be compromised. If a game requires a specific controller, other platforms might struggle to work around it. Unfortunately, taking the time to make sure they can nail it can be a Herculean task, especially if the higher-ups are rushing the creators, forcing them to cut corners when they should be triple checking everything. If you've considered purchasing a video game that kept receiving rave reviews, it's probably sensible to double check if it was rated well on your console of choice. No matter how good an RPG, beat 'em up or open world title might be, there's always a chance it got screwed up on one console, and we're gonna get you covered as to which those were. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are the 10 worst video game ports ever. Number 10. X-Men vs. Street Fighter, PlayStation. X-Men vs. Street Fighter was a real trailblazer as it's directly responsible for introducing tag team mechanics to fighting games. Rather than throwing in the mechanic as a gimmick, Capcom made sure that swapping characters in and out of battle accentuated the gaming experience. Teammates healed when they weren't being used, so players had to be strategic when to tag them in. Your buddy could be tagged in for a second, which was also vital for counters. And both combatants could be summoned simultaneously to perform a screen-filling special move, obliterating your opponents in seconds. Though the arcade title transitioned to the Sega Saturn flawlessly, the PlayStation version was not so lucky, and that is putting it lightly. The unmitigated disaster suffered from poor animation quality, constant slowdown, exhausting loading screens, and a muddled soundtrack. Worst of all, the tag team mechanic was inexplicably removed from the PS1 version, despite the fact that it was X-Men vs. Street Fighter's biggest selling point. You could still select two combatants, but switching them in mid-battle wasn't an option. Even though the Saturn is branded as a failure, this is one of the few times where it came out on top over Sony. Number 9. Resident Evil 4, Mobile Edition, Zeebo. Since Resident Evil 4 is one of the most ported video games of, well, all of video game history, it's easy to forget that this one started as a GameCube exclusive, but since it went gangbusters and was rightly celebrated as one of the best video games of all time, Capcom decided to bring it out on just about everything. But bringing Resi 4 to the Zeebo was a bridge too far, especially since most people, including me, didn't even know it existed. The hardware of the discontinued entertainment system was so limited, the creators might as well have called it the undead shooter on the Commodore. Resident Evil 4 Mobile Edition removed the cinematic sequences, several memorable enemies, and some of the best weapons. The blood was also cut, which kinda makes you wonder why Capcom bothered porting an 18-rated game in the first place. Not only that, the gameplay was drastically different. Rather than moving from one place to another, each area exists separately. After completing a section, you automatically move to the next one, ruining the immersion. Also, many defining levels were removed, so the main campaign can be beaten in 3 hours. Even though Capcom did admittedly release Resident Evil 4 on a bunch of other platforms, most of which are just so other people can experience this 10 out of 10 hell of a game, but the mobile edition was definitely just out of greed. Number 8. Carmageddon 64, Nintendo 64. Stainless Games' Carmageddon stood out over other driving games because it focused less on racing and more on reducing pedestrians to a bloody smear on the pavement. After the Motor Mayhem title sold well on the MS-DOS and the PC, the sequel was ported to mainstream consoles. Although the PC version was an absolute knockout, other platforms were not so lucky, namely the Nintendo 64 version, which was called Carmageddon 64. The smallest collision sends your car flying, so more time is spent in the air than on the road. The unresponsive controls make sharp turns pretty much impossible, and there's no track map, so getting lost on the poorly designed levels is basically guaranteed. But another major reason why Carmageddon 64 drew the ire of players is because it censored the gore by replacing the pedestrians with zombies. Crashing into these hobbling flesh eaters causes them to spew cartoonishly green goo, which just isn't as satisfying as watching them burst into a fountain of blood. Considering Nintendo already experienced what it was like to lose a ton of money on Mortal Kombat, where they also decided to take out the gore, it's kind of strange that they decided to pull that same stunt again. Number 7. SimCity 2000, Sega Saturn. Sega seemed fairly confident that SimCity 2000 was going to be a big hit on the Saturn, since it was among the first games announced for the console. On top of that, the iteration boasted bonus features including 3D animations, CD quality soundtracks, sharper sound effects, as well as FMV sequences. Even though the city building sim was ported to over a dozen different systems, the Saturn version was shaping up to be the best of the bunch. But none of those Saturn-only bells and whistles really ended up meaning anything, and that's for one simple reason. The console dropped the ball on pretty much the main thing that you cannot drop the ball on, and that's the gameplay. Thanks to the blurry visuals, it's hard to tell what you're clicking on half the time, and the bulky sidebar blocks off nearly half the screen, so you can't even admire your creations. Although this version of SimCity 2000 did have those additional features, it was also missing key aspects. That included the disasters mechanics, though these were incorporated into the expansion pack. Sadly, the game becomes worse over time, since expanding your settlement causes a dramatic slowdown. Since the lag becomes more noticeable the more you construct, it stops being fun really quickly. As a result, as you can imagine, the average player pretty much decided to give up well before they'd made their city. Number 6, The Outer Worlds, Switch. The Switch has an uphill battle when it comes to current gen ports due to its limited hardware. Having said that though, there are graphic-heavy ports that you'd think would struggle on the Switch that in fact play flawlessly, like Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice and Doom Eternal. Unfortunately, Virtuous's Switch port of The Outer Worlds was not one of them. The futuristic mini RPG that kinda gave Fallout a run for its money, certainly when it came out, might have been fantastic on a bunch of other platforms, but Nintendo fumbled it. The downgraded graphics dilute the luscious open world, so this port resembles a PS2 title instead of a Switch one. Though concessions were absolutely necessary for The Outer Worlds to function on a handheld, these compromises just weren't worth it. The map struggles to load textures while running, so moving any faster than a brisk jog grinds the gameplay to a halt. Despite the crunched textures and impaired lighting, the gameplay lags like crazy when a handful of NPCs are on screen. The gameplay was meant to be capped at 30 frames per second, but it often slows to 20 frames per second for no apparent reason. It is also absolutely worth mentioning that this ported version of The Outer Worlds was delayed for 3 months, so you can only imagine what it must have looked like 3 months before the crappy version that y'all got. Number 5, Doom 3DO. It's understandable why everybody wanted a slice of the Doom pie. With that said, some studios had more luck with it than others when it comes to bringing id Software's hellish shooter to their console. However, no platform had it harder than the 3DO. This incarnation of Doom was intended to be bigger and better than the original, boasting extra levels, weapons, enemies, and full motion video cutscenes. But due to gross mismanagement, the lead programmer Rebecca Heinemann had only 10 weeks to finish the project. So basically, cuts had to be made left, right, and center, and up and down, all over the place. To the surprise of nobody, the final product was marred with problems. This doomed port of Doom had atrocious loading times, bland colors, distracting side borders, and a choppy frame rate. Also, none of the original music was included due to time restraints, so the soundtracks in this version were performed by the CEO's band. Yes, you heard that correctly. The poor music and janky enemy movements didn't just ruin the gameplay, but also the creepy atmosphere, which has always been integral to the franchise. Even though Doom 3DO was planned to surpass its predecessor in every way imaginable, it instead is absolutely the worst platform on which you can play Doom. Number 4, Dead Rising, Chop Till You Drop, Wii. The Resident Evil 4 port on the Wii was a huge success, incentivizing Capcom to work on porting another popular zombie franchise, Dead Rising. Dead Rising Chop Till You Drop, which is a port of the Xbox 360's Dead Rising, looked like it'd be easy to transition onto the Nintendo console, considering it had the same engine as the Wii version of Resi 4. Unfortunately, Chop Till You Drop was an enormous letdown. Due to massively limited time and money, this was another victim of being chopped till it dropped. The photography system, which was a key feature in the original, was just removed entirely. Although Dead Rising is renowned for its non-linearity, Chop Till You Drop implemented more structured gameplay, so it barely felt like the same game. Sadly though, the biggest compromise was the stars of the show, of course, the zombies. Though the classic version could feature up to 800 of the flesh eaters on screen at once, Chop Till You Drop could barely manage 1/8 of that amount. Since plowing through a never-ending wave of revenants is basically why people want to play Dead Rising in the first place, it's pretty clear that Capcom shouldn't have bothered with this one. Number 3. Batman Arkham Knight, PC. Batman Arkham Knight had a ton of pre-release hype since it served as the final chapter of Rocksteady's biggest IP. Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League does not count here. Apart from the laborious Batmobile sections, Arkham Knight proved to be a satisfying conclusion to the franchise. However, anyone who had the misfortune of playing on PC probably does not feel that way, since the amount of glitches does make it feel like you've been infected with Scarecrow's fear gas. Even top-of-the-line graphics cards didn't make a difference to Arkham Knight's stuttering, as well as its low-res textures, 10 frames per second drops, and frequent crashes. The abominable port was considered virtually unplayable, literally, urging the company to suspend sales until it was amended. Several months later, the game was re-released, with the developers promising that all major issues had been straightened out. Although the patch improved the optimization, textures, and a few other issues, Arkham Knight still suffered from a noticeable lag. That then ruined crucial aspects of the gameplay like combat, driving, and gliding. So kind of all the gameplay. As such, Warner Brothers was left with no other option than to basically give players all of their money back if they happen to be subjected to this port. Number 2, Ark Survival Evolved, Switch. Ark Survival Evolved is by no means a perfect game. Studio Wildcard's Dino Shooter suffers from difficulty spikes, grind-heavy gameplay, and tedious side quests. Despite these problems, the open-world survival title still has plenty to offer. But the same just can't be said of the Switch version. Even though many of the flagrant problems had been remedied, it's still shocking this one was decided to be good enough to be released. When it debuted, everything was bathed in a blurry sheen, which barely hid the barren environments and low-resolution textures. Trees, shrubs, and rocks were so low poly they wouldn't look out of place on the Jaguar. Despite the fact that the visual quality and content had been scaled back to an insulting degree, the gameplay was also plagued with performance issues and excruciating loading times. The only reason why Ark Survival Evolved isn't topping this list is because Grove Street Games pulled a No Man's Sky and completely rebuilt the game, creating a damn near perfect port. If these glaring issues weren't patched up, then Ark Survival Evolved absolutely could be in the running for worst Switch port of all time, and almost definitely would have topped our list, but more on that in a second. Number 1, Street Fighter II ZX Spectrum. You can't blame anyone for trying to port Street Fighter II to their console. Being the most celebrated fighting game of all time, it's understandable why everybody in the gaming industry would want a cut of the action. But you need to know your limitations. Unsatisfied with Street Fighter II being on almost every system under the sun, Capcom, we're rocking up a lot here, they decided to bring Ryu, Ken, Chun-Li, and the rest of the gang to the ZX Spectrum. Now, a bunch of players were justifiably cynical as to how Street Fighter II was going to function on an 8-bit console from 1982. And they should have been skeptical because it didn't work. Even though the fireball blasting brawler is renowned for its fluid gameplay, accessible special moves, and smooth combos, the ZX Spectrum version has none of that. Moving around is so slow and imprecise, it is a joyless experience for anybody. The blinding color palette is reminiscent of Nintendo's Virtual Boy, since looking at the screen for too long is headache-inducing. Although there is no music, so that's probably a good thing, as one can only imagine how the creators would have butchered the iconic tunes. Unless you want to see Zangief and E Honda move at 10 frames per second while your eyes feel like they're being burned out of your skull, you probably want to avoid this port and play Street Fighter II on any other console.